So welcome everybody to this event about climate bargaining. And before I'm going to say anything at all, we're going to watch a movie. And I'll have a question later.
Everyone was warned, but no one listened. A rise in temperature, ocean patterns changed, and ice caps melted. They called it extreme weather. They didn't know what extreme was. In the year of 2019, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and droughts unleashed a wave of destruction upon our planet. We didn't just lose towns or beachfronts. We lost entire cities. The East River swallowed Lower Manhattan. A heat wave killed 2 million people in Madrid in just one day. But in that moment, facing our own extinction, it became clear that no single nation could solve this problem alone. The world came together as one, and we fought back. Scientists from 17 countries, led by the US and China, worked tirelessly, not as representatives of their nations, but of humanity. They found a way to neutralize the storms, with a net of thousands of satellites, each deploying countermeasures designed to impact the basic elements of weather: heat, pressure, and water, all overseen by the International Space Station. They gave the satellite net a technical name, but we all came to call it Dutch Boy, after the story of the child who plugged a dam with his finger. This is what saved us all. And it was built by a team led by one man. My father.
All right. So hello everyone. Welcome to this event about geoengineering, the fourth event in the series about climate grief organized by Studium Generale. And my name is Aafke Fraaije. I am your host today. And the video we just watched is the opening scene of a movie from 2017 called Geostorm. And it's set in the late 2020s. And in this movie, a geoengineering technology called Dutch Boy is developed as a solution to the consequences of climate change. Has any one of you seen this movie? Can you raise a hand if you've seen it? Who hasn't seen it? Can you raise your hand? Anyone who didn't raise their hand yet? Who maybe isn't sure whether they've seen it. So it doesn't at all matter whether you've seen it or not. What I would like you to do right now is to talk to your neighbor and discuss how this opening scene made you feel. What did you feel when you were watching this little movie? Please take a minute or two. So please tell me, can you raise your hand if this movie raised any positive emotions in you? Did it evoke any positive emotions? Oh, Marieke. I happen to know her name is Marieke because she's part of Studium Generale. Yeah. Can you share with us what positive emotions did the movie raise?
I felt a kind of relief when I saw the buildings being washed away, because then it could all be over and you don't have to worry about it anymore.
Great. So the existential threat here is you embrace it. Nice. And you also raised your hand? Yeah? Can you share?
Yeah. Mixed feelings. Positive when all the countries were working together and uniting and there was peace and solving this problem. Hell yeah, let's go. But then fighting these symptoms with technology and taking over, I was like, maybe not the way also. Yeah. So... yeah, no.
Yeah, no. Does anyone recognize the yeah, no feeling? Yeah, some of you do. And what made you feel maybe no?
That it is not fighting the problem, but the symptoms of it. And I don't know what the collateral damage of that would be. So that I'm like, are we not making another problem?
All right. Are we fighting the cause or the consequences? And are we not creating new problems? All right. So not many of you had very positive emotions. Did any one of you feel strong negative emotions? Can you raise your hand? Yeah? Also a few of you? Can you share what was so difficult about it for you?
Yeah, because for me it was not only no, it was like no. I don't even like this idea of all of the world working together. It's working, like I always feel like any peace moment has like some tensions hidden and that are not made explicit, and especially if it's a peace driven by the US and China. Like what about what everybody else thinks, you know? So yeah, so it's like kind of like no.
Yeah. So the feeling of peace here, it felt a bit superficial to you. You're like, what are we not seeing? What tensions are we not seeing? All right, thanks. I saw some hands also there. Yeah, do you want to share?
Yeah, for me it was also a bit realistic in a way, because only the first part, like that we start doing something when there's going something dramatically wrong. And that is, I think, how we are treating it now as well, that we wait until there's something very big, and then everyone comes together and thinks, oh, maybe we should do something. So it was quite depressing, yeah.
All right, so it was depressing because you recognized something from our real life, and you thought this, waiting until the final end, that's what you recognized. Yeah. Anyone else who had something else? I think you also had hands raised, yeah?
Yeah, for me it was quite cool, because my premise is that the way to save the world is to invent new technologies to do so. So to see this satellite system to be able to do that, I think like, well, then the problem is solved and we can all go home and enjoy life. So the solution part, I think really cool. I think that's the way to go. I was cringing a lot at, all the disasters and stuff. It's like, oh, I don't really look at it like that. So that was the hesitance in the positive part, but technology will save the world as far as I'm concerned, and that was very nice.
Right, you said really this idea of, hey, with technology, I'm an engineering student working to create technology that, like in this movie, can really fix the world. Yeah, nice. And you also had your hand raised, I think.
We were briefly speculating about running the film backwards, and try and interfere in all sorts of ways in the climate, and then perhaps things going wrong afterwards. So that was a little thought experiment we had in this corner.
Yeah, so in that case, I mean, it raised negative emotions in the sense you felt, is this the right chronology, let's say? And could it also be the other way around? I think this is only the first 2 minutes of the movie. If you watch the rest, maybe you recognize your new idea. All right, thank you. Do any one of the speakers want to reflect on what emotions it raised in them?
I can.
Yeah? Oh, yeah, you have your own.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, first off, many positive emotions because of how hilariously bad the movie is. Like, I watched it in the cinema when I was doing my PhD on this topic, and it was so much joy. But then also, the discussion around it was very interesting to me, and I will talk to specifically our technological optimists there. By the end of these talks, I hope you will change your mind a little bit.
That's not why we came here. All right, thanks, Jeroen. Any of the others who want to share?
I'll save that for later.
Yeah, save it for later. That's totally fine. So, did anyone have any emotions about this movie that were not positive or negative or anything in between that they still want to share? Okay. So, why did I pick this movie to start with this session? I think this movie depicts some of the really strong hopes and desires we have for technological weather control systems in times of climate change. And indeed, in yet another year in which climate records are broken one after another, it may be tempting to imagine a world where we can regulate the weather. And while the Dutch boy in this movie may be a fantasy, people all over the world and also at this university are working towards geoengineering applications as we speak. The most common types of which are carbon dioxide removal and so capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and solar radiation management, trying to reduce the amount of sunlight that reaches Earth's surface, typically by sending tiny particles into the sky. Some believe that such geoengineering solutions should be an option in the face of severe climate change consequences. Yet geoengineering also presents many uncertainties and moral dilemmas which raise various questions like, do the risks outweigh the benefits? Under what conditions, if any, would its application be justified? And should we be talking about geoengineering in the first place, considering that this might take attention away from other, less risky but essential climate change responses like fossil fuel reduction? These are some of the questions we'll be exploring today. And to this end, we have lined up 3 speakers for you from different fields, as well as a contribution from artist in residence, Letizia Artioli. The purpose of today is to have a meaningful conversation about this topic, so please feel invited to share what's on your mind. Can you raise hands if you've been to any of these climate grief events before? Yeah, so I think we have a good group here who knows how it works, so please give a good example. So, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. He is an assistant professor of ethics and philosophy of technology here at the TU Delft. His research focuses on what we can learn about ourselves and our moral viewpoints when we take our emotions seriously and our climate emotions specifically. Please give it up for James Hutton.
Thank you very much. So I'm an ethicist. Let me just try again. I'm an ethicist, and I have a suspicion. I'd like you to think for a moment whether you have an opinion on whether geoengineering is good or bad, justified or unjustified. I'm not going to ask you to share it just yet. I have a suspicion that we're not clear enough about the concept of geoengineering for us to all be talking about the same thing. Okay? I'm going to try and bring that out. Yeah, that's the first part of the talk. I'm going to try and elicit some thoughts about what this term even means. Is it even a helpful label? We're going to play a game of, is this geoengineering? So we're going to go through a range of possible policy options, and I'm going to get you guys to just simply raise your hands. Do you think this counts as geoengineering? Or do you think this is a policy that doesn't count as geoengineering? And then we're going to look at some proposed definitions and see if we can tidy things up, or perhaps not. So, is this geoengineering? Injecting aerosols into the atmosphere to produce more clouds. Hands up if you think this is geoengineering. Great. Most people put their hands up, not everyone. Next. Launching mirrors into space to reflect more sunlight. Is this geoengineering? Again, almost everyone. Some people not putting their hands up. Let's keep going. What about painting rooftops white to reflect more sunlight? Is this geoengineering? Okay, we're getting a little bit less clarity. We've got quite a few people putting their hands up. We've got quite a lot of people not putting their hands up, and we've got some people wondering, does this count? Let's keep going. Building solar panels in every country on Earth, is this geoengineering? Some people shaking their heads. Let's press on. Seeding the oceans with iron to stimulate the growth of plankton. Is this geoengineering? Again, more people saying yes, but not everyone's sure. What about planting 1 trillion trees to draw down CO2? Is this geoengineering? Some people think so. Many people are not sure. When is this game going to end, James? When are we going to get to the point? Let's have a couple more. Okay. What about capturing CO2 from steel factories? Is this geoengineering? Some people think it is. Actually, not necessarily the same people always putting their hands up. One more. Does it make a difference? What if we're capturing it straight from the air? Is this geoengineering? More people think that that's geoengineering. Okay, so how do we define geoengineering? The key thing that I want you to notice is the lack of agreement in this room of people who have chosen to spend their free time coming to an event on geoengineering, on what geoengineering even is, which policies even count as geoengineering. on the face of it, this seems like a problem. If we're going to be having a discussion, so what do you think about geoengineering? Do you think geoengineering is ever justified? You might not realize that what you're thinking about when you use the term is actually quite different and only overlaps a little bit with what the person you're talking to is meaning. So perhaps you're arguing vehemently in favor of geoengineering as a possible way of saving the planet, or you're arguing vehemently against geoengineering as too risky or a false hope, a distraction. But maybe you actually have the same opinion and it's all just being clouded by this term that people use in different ways. Right? Or maybe you think you're agreeing, but actually one of you is talking about planting 1 trillion trees and the other one's talking about space mirrors, and you wouldn't dream of endorsing the same things. But okay, surely there's a way of tidying this up. Surely some people sitting around and thinking about definitions and clarifying things can make matters better. So here are some attempts. The Royal Society of London proposes this definition. Geoengineering is deliberate, large-scale manipulation of the planetary environment to counteract anthropogenic climate change. Think about that for a second. Almost all of the policy options I included in that PowerPoint count as geoengineering under this definition. Planting 1 trillion trees is certainly a deliberate, large-scale manipulation of the planetary environment aimed at counteracting anthropogenic climate change. So this definition seems incredibly broad. If this is what we're talking about, then that's going to cover a huge range of options. I doubt that many of us here are opposed to planting 1 trillion trees, although many of us are opposed to geoengineering. So this doesn't look like a very helpful definition. It's just too broad. Building solar panels in every country in the world, that seems like a large-scale manipulation of the environment, right? I mean, maybe we could try and tidy up the terms to exclude that, but at least on the face of it, this is either too vague or it just includes everything. Geoengineering is supposed to be different from the clean energy transition, right? So this definition isn't very helpful. Let's try another. The economist Thomas Schelling proposes that for something to count as geoengineering, it has to be global, intentional, and unnatural. I'm not sure if this is helpful at all. What on earth is natural? Okay, so sure, like lots of these things, space mirrors, they're not going to be natural. But solar panels, they're not natural. And if it's on a global scale, built in every country, then that's, again, solar panels are going to be part of this definition. And what about the 1 trillion trees, the thing that most of us think is probably not a case of geoengineering? Is that natural? Is it not natural? I don't even know. Like trees, they're kind of natural, but loads of people going out and planting them with like stakes and fertilizers. Is that natural? I don't even know. This is just not helpful. So I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that we can get anywhere with this label. The philosopher Dale Jameson at New York University is skeptical too. He writes, geoengineering does not mark a specific category of response to climate change. He thinks there isn't a particular type of thing that the term geoengineering picks out. Dale Jameson argues that the term geoengineering simply alerts us to the fact that the approach under discussion is being viewed as novel, weird, exotic, unfamiliar, or untested. Okay? It's more of what he calls an attitudinal marker than a description of a particular space of policy options. And that suggests that if we're trying to kind of reflect and discuss whether geoengineering is permissible or not, we're going to be falling into a trap. We're going to be using a term which doesn't pick out anything specific and maybe falling into confusion for that reason. So here's my hunch about the concept of geoengineering. It might be useful for some purposes, but I think it's pretty unhelpful as a label for other purposes because of the kind of disagreement about what even counts as geoengineering that we experienced just now. Don't worry, this isn't going to undermine the whole conversation this evening. In fact, these guys, talking to them earlier on, are also very up for problematizing the concept. I also think, therefore, that we should probably be talking more about specific policy options. This isn't because I'm trying to kind of sneak space mirrors into the atmosphere without you guys realizing by keeping it at the conceptual level. But I do think it's probably worth talking about what is it about 1 trillion trees that seems okay? What is it about space mirrors that seems risky? What is it, without trying to beg any questions, we should perhaps be speaking at a finer grain rather than trying to generalize about geoengineering as if it were one coherent set of options. Nevertheless, the term geoengineering gets people to show up to a talk. It gets politicians to prick up their ears. So I'm not trying to say we should abandon this term altogether, but maybe we should think of it as more of rhetorical use rather than as something that's useful for scientific purposes. And I by no means mean to denigrate rhetoric. Rhetoric is an incredibly powerful political tool. So perhaps the term geoengineering can be a powerful political tool. Here's how our old pal Dale Jameson puts it: so long as we see the use of the label geoengineering as an attitudinal marker of suspicion and do not confuse it with a term that delineates a distinct category of responses, then it may still have a role to play in the policy debate. Okay? I think there's reason to be skeptical that geoengineering is a thing, but not every term has to be a useful way of picking out a class of policy options to be helpful. Think about the role that, you know, even insults have their place, right? Maybe geoengineering is basically an insult. And certain policy options, maybe they deserve to be insulted, okay? If you've spent your time and thought carefully about the ethics of a certain policy option, and you think it's weird and suspicious, and that people should be alerted to that fact, then fine, call it geoengineering. Maybe use that as an insult. I'm going to very quickly segue into some ethical reflection about one particular type of geoengineering. So remember this old option. I think everyone said this was geoengineering. Maybe one or two people didn't, but who cares if it's geoengineering? That's not what we need to worry about. Let's think very quickly about the pros and cons of this kind of option. So the pros would be, well, look, 1.1 degrees C is where we're at now, and it's already pretty awful, okay? We're in danger of crossing irreversible tipping points, and loads of people's lives are being cut short or otherwise ruined. So if you're opposed to injecting aerosols into the air, I don't necessarily disagree with you. But I think you have to take very seriously that someone who does disagree with you, they're not necessarily just you know, a shill for the fossil fuel industry. It's a very serious price to pay to not use this technology if there's reason to think it works. But on the other hand, I'm not trying to convince you that you should definitely do it. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm just gesturing towards some ways of thinking about this. Of course, the Earth is a chaotic system, as we all know. And that means that it's really, really hard to predict what the potential downsides of injecting aerosols into the atmosphere would be. And one thing that we're going to hear a lot about is the way in which going with these options and even talking about these options changes the political landscape and potentially gets people off the hook for taking other kinds of response. So the risks of using or even pursuing this are enormous. And I think what I want to do is just leave you with this question. What do you think? Do the harms outweigh the risks? Do the risks outweigh the benefits? I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, James. So, please, tell us, what do you think? Do the risks outweigh the benefits, or the benefits outweigh the risks in the case of aerosol injection?
Stratospheric aerosol.
Stratospheric aerosol injection. Yeah.
Well, the first question I would have, like, are we even assured the benefits? Because yes, those things are ruining lives, but is this actually solving that?
Yeah. So what? Yeah, you're saying the risks outweigh the benefits as if these are pre-given, as if these are existent. Well, you know, we don't know how it works out. Yeah. Does anyone want to respond to that? Yeah.
I think we don't know is a pretty accurate summary. You know, there's lots of uncertainties, you know, ranging from technological to atmospheric sciences to just the climate system as a whole, then to the whole decision-making process, morals, governance, right? So yeah, it's totally true that there's a lot of things that we don't know. Full stop. So.
All right, so yes. Does that help us any further in this question of how the risks outweigh the benefits, or the other way around? Yeah?
I can jump in on this because there are also a lot of things that we do know, especially about the decision-making processes and why we're not doing anything about climate change, right? And I will speak a bit more about this later, but I think we should very much keep in mind that these technologies, there isn't an ethical question around it that we'll answer at some point, or a political question that we'll answer at some point. It'll happen in a sort of chaotically political situation. That we absolutely do know for sure. So there isn't this technology that we might be implementing in a rational way. That won't happen. So we have to think very critically about what that means for our responsibility as researchers and your responsibilities as a public, and I'll talk more about that.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying even asking this question or trying to answer this question in a rational way kind of implies that there will be kind of a decision-making moment where we decide to do or to not implement this technology, while you're saying this will happen in a very chaotic and messy manner anyway, and that has implications for how we treat this.
Yeah, I think asking this question separates out the question of how do we address climate change, and then very specifically the temperature question of climate change, from all kinds of other considerations that are also out in the world. Right? Geopolitical power, who is going to actually allow for this to happen? Or concerns about keeping certain economic structures in play. For who is this going to be beneficial? So these kinds of questions will always weigh in. And well, again, I will speak a bit more about that, but I think it's good to clarify that immediately.
Yeah. So the ethical question as it's posed here kind of is not actually in reality separated from geopolitical reality and whatever. Yeah? Yeah. Does anyone want to respond to that? Yeah?
Yeah, mostly a question about this power. Could, for example, like a country by itself, like an India or something, decide by itself, I'm going to decide this for the world and do it myself because it's my atmosphere. It will spread to all the other countries. So do we need to unify and decide as one world that we're going to do this approach? Or I don't know what the law says about this or how it's possible or how to regulate.
And before we go on and try to answer this question, can you clarify why you asked this question?
Because it's so this chaotic system with all these powers, and I think as well, like for example, in the country of India, they have a lot of the bad sides of climate change. So if something would happen, I can imagine they want to act up more severely and quickly than us in Europe, who are relatively safe-ish. So I think this is also a very political, dangerous field.
Yeah. And are you saying, even answering this question of whether it's ethical doesn't really make sense if countries like India could, start doing it tomorrow, whether we agree with it or not?
I think we should act quick before people start acting by themselves and playing for hero.
Right. We need an approach before that. Yeah, that's what you're saying. Anyone want to respond to this question of how this works? Does anyone know? I'm looking at Jeroen. Do you know?
Well, I mean, there's a technical question to this, in which case the answer is yes. Like any country, any medium-sized country could do this. But this doesn't, like medium-sized being, probably if the Netherlands really wanted a program like this, they could build it, right? Legally, or sort of, so legally also, any country could probably do this, because you could do it over the oceans, which are treated legally as a commons. You could probably not do it over someone else's territory, but you could just implement it over, say, the Pacific Ocean and then hope that it spreads. And it would probably spread that way. Politically, you probably couldn't, right? Unless some of the other large geopolitical powers would allow you to, which is conceivable, but it's the political question there that is really problematic. But we have absolutely no legal frameworks on this. Like nothing, except for the fact that you can't weaponize it.
All right, thanks. Does anyone want to respond? Yeah?
I think, yeah, any medium-sized country can do it, but I also think that the outcome is important. So what if you harm other countries? Like we did the Shell case. So if I hurt another country with my technology, what would that mean for me legally?
Legally and politically, I think, or Jeroen is kind of specifying this as politically, right?
Well, again, we genuinely don't know. There has been a research project in Germany on this, on particularly this question, but the problem is we just don't know what these technologies will do once you implement them, right? So we have model studies, but it's quite likely that, so the research study was, I think, that Australia at some point in that study or another country was implementing this, and then Poland had a drought and had no good harvest, right? And so they were taking this to the court. That's sort of the scenario that they were working with. And they found out, well, okay, but you have tons of modeling studies saying it has absolutely no effect, and tons of modeling studies that says, well, actually, that was a cause of the drought. How do you weigh this in a court of law? No one knows at this point. So again, then it becomes a political question, right? Who can make the other countries stop or pay reparations?
But it's also a physical sciences question, right? Like, how do you attribute changes in climate to certain actions? So also for that reason, it's really difficult to hold people or countries liable to certain things, right? And it might well be that because there's like a lot of uncertainty in the climate system, if there is an action, it could also be that nothing happens, right?
Do you want to respond to that? Did that answer your question? It's complex matter, huh? Okay, thanks. Anyone else who wants to respond at this time? Yeah?
And I think as researchers and engineers at the university, we want to try things out, and this can never be tried. You can have these models. We have a problem with the models. That's what we just have seen. And you cannot do it in an experiment in a lab. And therefore, we just cannot do it, in my opinion.
Yeah, so you're saying we don't have like a testing ground for this at the scale which matters. And what conclusion do you draw from that?
We don't do it. Yeah? Can you repeat it in the microphone? We won't do it. I wouldn't do it.
So for you, the benefits don't outweigh the risks because of that, because of the uncertainties?
We don't know the risks. We cannot test the risks, so therefore we cannot. Yeah, it's unethical, I would say, that to do it if you don't know what you do.
Yeah, so I feel like similarly about the situation, but I also want to introduce another point which is also mentioned on the slide here, which is that it could be, these technologies could be used as an excuse not to drastically cut down on fossil fuel consumption. And I mean, this is what is already happening right now. I mean, I don't know if anybody has been following the COP28 lately. Not great. I mean, you can really see how vested interests have a huge, enormous influence on climate policymaking. So I definitely see this as one of the major reasons as to not employ this technology.
Right, because it kind of draws attention away, or it can be used rhetorically. Let's say, oh, we're already fighting climate change, so then we don't really have to change any of the difficult things. All right. Yeah.
At the university, it also comes to doing research towards these methods, and that also means that we would spend lots of euros on it. We cannot spend on research doing on PV panels or whatever. So therefore, that adds to my argument.
Yeah. So you're saying resources can only be spent once. Let's spend them on other measures rather than this risky one. Yeah. All right. I think time for one last response, and then we move on to the next speaker.
Cool. Thanks. So a bit of a segue maybe, but I would like to point out, we now discussed about, well, do we know if it has any benefits? And I would want to put it out there as I'm the last speaker now. We'll do that at the rings, I think, because I find it very interesting. But how sure are we that even 1.5 is going to be such a horrible outcome? And if that isn't such a horrible outcome, then also it wouldn't really be necessary, right? So there's also uncertainty there. And I'm very interested in that uncertainty as well.
Right, you're saying make the conversation more symmetrical. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, you guess. That's okay for now. Symmetrical in the sense that if we're concerned about uncertainties in one direction, we should also be considering the uncertainties in the other direction. Yeah? Okay. All right. Oh. This is, of course, a very interesting remark.
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly respond to that. So I think that's a huge fallacy, and it really gives way to climate delay tactics. I don't know if you've heard of the precautionary principle before, because I think that's really applicable to the climate crisis, which basically says that based on the current knowledge and the current science that we have, we can be pretty sure, not 100% sure, of the catastrophe that is going to unfold if we just let climate change do its thing. So we have to do whatever is possible in order to prevent that from happening. And of course, the efforts have to match the predicted negative consequences that would occur if we didn't take these efforts. It should be in relation. But I don't think it's really... I mean, for me, the argument doesn't hold to say, but we're not 100% sure that the catastrophes are going to be as big as we currently think they will be.
Yeah, you're saying the risks are could be so severe that they are worth considering, even if we're not 100% sure. Yeah? All right. Significant, yeah. All right, I think we will continue the discussion anyway, so...
Can I invite you for a drink afterwards so that you can hash this out further?
Nice. It's a conversation starter, this ethics presentation by James. Please give it up for James. All right, now from ethics to the science. So now I would like to invite our next speaker, who is also, I think, an assistant professor here at the TU Delft, but then at the Civil Engineering and Geoscience faculty. She's a scientist who studies how our climate is being influenced by how clouds behave at the micro level, and she currently focuses on the different disciplines involved in climate engineering. Please give it up for Isabelle Steinke.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So, we watched Geostorm, but actually I'm a much bigger fan of Snowpiercer. I'm biased because it's a Korean movie, but the premise of that movie is we've done climate engineering and it has gone bad. So the only way we have now is to live in a train and like lots of social conflicts unfold. And I just love this movie because it's a really crazy Korean movie. But yeah, also just to think about it, you know, like, I mean, this is something that we definitely don't want to have, right? Snowball Earth is not something that I'm going for. And so what I want to start with is, so first of all, in most cases, I'll talk about climate engineering, because I'm at Civil Engineering and Geosciences, and we have people working on geoengineering, which is more reservoir engineering. So it's always a little confusing for me when people talk about geoengineering. So I'll talk about climate engineering. And what I want to point out here is that it just really, you know, lots of different aspects come into play here, right? So it's really a sciences question, it's a technology question, it's ethics, and it's political sciences. And so we really need to have all those different things, you know, and also it's a hugely complex issue. So it's definitely not one of those cases where it's like black and white, right? So there's lots of gray in between. So that's just what I want to point out. There's like 3 things that I would like to discuss with you today. So one is, why are we even thinking about climate engineering? Then what are different options for climate engineering? And I'll chat a bit more about like one concrete option, just to give a bit more context. And then I'll talk at the end a bit, what do we need to really, you know, make a decision or think about that kind of technology options. So let's get started. So James already mentioned a bit about that. So the situation we're facing right now is that even if all the commitments are implemented as planned, the CO2 emissions are still leveling off in a way, right? So but as you can see here, there's also huge uncertainty in the range of emissions that we'll have. So that's a pretty difficult setting also to make decisions. But what you can also see that to get to sustainable temperature levels that have been discussed, we also need a significant amount of negative emissions. So we need to, not only get emissions down, but we also need to make sure that we can actually get to a stage where we can really reduce emissions, by CO2 capture, for example, even more. And those technologies are currently also not really available. So this is kind of, the dilemma we're stuck at right now, because we definitely want to get temperatures down as of now, and COP has been mentioned, right? And the whole negotiation process is really a struggle. So yeah, it's a bit of a question. And the other really big uncertainty in here is not only related to the physical system, but it's also really what you can see here. These are different scenarios about the future, making assumptions about how emissions can develop. But that also hugely depends on what's going to happen, in the economy and how, for example, how high mitigation or adaptation challenges are, how well cooperation will work between countries, right? So it's incredibly difficult for us to predict the future in either way, right? Like whether good or bad. So this is really the struggle that we're facing. And then if we talk about climate change and about weighing risks, what we have in the end really, or what we should have in mind in the end is really the people, right? So human beings who are vulnerable to climate change, and this is what we want to prevent, So this is also why I think it really makes sense to consider like all the options of adaptation, mitigation, and we should also know at some point whether radiation management, for example, might be an option or not. And it could be very well be that it is totally not an option. So at this point, I'd say, wow, I'm like super echoey here. I'm sorry. Yeah, it might be not an option, but if we talk about risks, we're really thinking about those very vulnerable communities, right? And the impacts on them all over the world. So this is what we want to prevent. And so I think, yeah, in our discussions, that should also be the focus, therefore. So options for cooling the climate. Just a tiny bit of physics, just very roughly. So this might be a bit confusing, but basically what's happening through the Earth's atmosphere is there's sunlight coming in, and some of it gets reflected, like a third gets reflected right away. And then there's the other part, where thermal radiation is emitted back to space as well. And in between, you have the atmosphere, and you have clouds, and all that kind of messiness that's going on. But eventually, everything will go out at some point. So, and this is the system that we want to change, if we're thinking about radiation management, so climate engineering. And as you can see, there's already like huge complexity just on the side of the physical sciences. So Jeroen has already mentioned there has been a German priority program on climate engineering like a while back. So it finished around 2020. And this is an overview of different technologies or concepts for technologies that they considered at that point. So for example, they distinguish also here between carbon dioxide removal, which is also now getting with negative emissions, and radiation management. So this is really, these are all the measures that kind of have a change or cause a change in the Earth's radiative budget. And so there's different flavors of that so-called radiation management. Some of them James has already mentioned. So for example, the stratospheric aerosol injections. So you see that airplane, for example, or also, for example, cloud seeding. And being an atmospheric scientist, I'm going to talk a bit more about cloud seeding. So one of the proposals for radiation management that has gotten a little bit less attention, also because it's more complicated from the physical sciences point, is marine cloud brightening. And what you can see here is lots of beautiful clouds over the ocean. And those white wriggly lines that you can see here are clouds that are viewed from a satellite, and those are ship tracks. So why are those clouds so much brighter than, you know, the ocean? And the reason is that those ships emit when they burn fuels, and they emit tiny particles, and on those particles you have clouds forming. And those clouds are a lot brighter than the background ocean. So the idea is basically to somehow create more clouds to make the whole thing more reflective, and thus, you know, kind of have more solar light being back emitted to space. But, you know, it's never as simple, you know, especially with clouds, because clouds are very complicated things, you know. They consist of droplets, of particles, of ice crystals in some cases, right? And they're very dynamic. So it doesn't mean that, you know, we just sprinkle a little something somewhere and the desired effect happens. That's not what's going to happen, because clouds, as I said, are very dynamic. So even on like this very basic level, it matters, for example, like what kind of materials you would use, but also the particle size of the particles that you would use for such a cloud seeding operation, right? Because you could totally screw it up, right? So like depending on particle size, you could either make your cloud rain and then it's gone and then you see the ocean again, or what you could also see is you could make it less cloudy if you use particles that are too small. So you might be very clever in asking what is too small and too large, and the answer is there's no definite answer, because, you know, it's a very variable environment. You know, think of winds and these kind of stuff, right? Or air that's getting entrained into clouds, you know, or just the particles that are there natural. So they also already form clouds, right? So it's not that you can really pinpoint this is exactly the right size, and then we're going to do it. So this is not how nature works. So what do we, if we think about it, and we say, you know, okay, maybe we can get the physics somehow under control, you know? So what else is there left? And so some people have been thinking about what kind of breakpoints could there be, you know, in marine cloud brightening. So points where research just, you know, really hits a wall and we say, this is not going to work, right? And just in the physical sciences, there's like 6 of them that they have proposed. And, you know, just the basic cloud microphysics is one of them. And that's a pretty strong one to overcome, right? And then there's also the technical aspects, right? Like even if we say, oh, this is the particle size and this is the material, then there's still the question like where to seed, for example, you know, and how to seed, like with what kind of nozzles, for example. So, and then there's also the question, like, as I said, where to seed, because all those dynamics that I mentioned mean that there's only very few regions of the Earth that are really suitable, at least depending on model simulations, right? Which also are to be taken with a grain of salt. And then the other point that I wanted to, or there's 2 more points that I wanted to mention. One is signal detection, so attribution. So that's something that I alluded to already, right? So even if we do something to the climate system, and assuming that we do it in a, you know, not super extreme way, which would be bias, then we still need to figure out, can this action, or can this signal that we see really be attributed to something we did, or is it just within the natural noise of our climate system, right? So that's a very tricky question. And the second thing is that even if we do, for example, something regional, so regional climate engineering, that would still have implications to other parts of the Earth, right? So there's lots of things or lots of points where this system could really hit a wall as well. However, because that was also mentioned, you know, like, is it a distraction or not? So the thing is, especially with the cloud microphysics part, cloud microphysics and climate models is a major uncertainty. So kind of the research that we do in that area is valuable, you know, because we learn better how the climate system in its natural state functions, right? So there's like some value in understanding how those processes work without even thinking about an application like climate engineering. So what I want to stop with here is really a pledge, you know, for people to get together, to like really discuss things openly, and also to join for interdisciplinary and interactive research. You know, this is something that's really, really important to me. And so I'm very glad that we're here, the three of us, you know, to discuss this topic. And the prompt or the question I want to leave you with is it really climate engineering, so in the engineering sense of the word, or is it more really a climate intervention, kind of like what James has pointed out to us as well? So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
All right, so the question is whether actually climate engineering, whether the title is right? Whether it is actually about engineering or whether much more disciplines are involved, as Isabella makes the case. So do you want to respond to that? Who wants to respond to that question? What do you think? Is it a matter of engineering? Or should more disciplines get involved?
Engineering the climate, it's there with many components. We are trying to adjust a little bit on the things. So I don't, and maybe engineering is not the right term, but it doesn't not matter, I think.
Right, maybe engineering implies too much control rather than what this is. This is more like making...
Build something up from, say, from scratch, that you engineer something like building a bridge or a building or so, and then if we are not engineering the climate.
Climate already exists. Yeah. Yeah, all right. So that's a maybe response to... How do you want to respond to that? You agree with that, I think, no?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And was there anything surprising about the talk by Isabella? Anything you heard for the first time or made you think? Something that surprised you or challenged you?
The insecurity about the size of the droplets we need. If we do not even know which droplets we need to and of how to produce them, that they have the suitable size in order to make the right clouds, and it can be useless because we don't do the right thing. That's
like the existential uncertainty here surprised you. Yeah. Did anyone share that? Did you also feel the same? A little bit. Other things that were surprising about her talk? Oh, James has one.
Yeah, are you gonna? Oh yeah. I'm interested in whether within your field of work people are so. One accusation that people make is to even have people doing research on this. Mm-hmm. There's a danger of giving politicians an easy way of walking away from the table, you know? Mm-hmm. Creating this space to say, oh, don't worry, we've got our best scientists working on we've got this step-by-step process, so, you know, a few years down the line, we'll know how to seed the clouds in just the right way. Do you, of course, that's not at all the way that you're presenting things. You're telling us there are many ways, there are many opportunities for this whole research program to produce a negative result. But do you worry that things getting simplified and used instrumentally by cynical people is a danger and perhaps a reason to shut down the research? Or do you think it's worth it?
Well, 2 points to that. So one is really, there is a danger, right? So if I put knowledge out there, I only have very limited control over it, right? So either how it's portrayed or how it is used, right? So, but then again, as I mentioned, you know, clouds themselves are just super fascinating, right? And we need to know more about them and how they form, why they form, and what impact they have just in our climate system. So there's reason just to do the fundamental part of my research, right? So.
Yeah, is that satisfactory, James?
I'm fascinated. We could talk about it all evening.
Does anyone from the audience want to respond? Yeah?
I agree with Isabella that there's something just to be known about clouds. Like clouds in itself is a research objective. But I think it's also interesting to ask, why are we studying clouds, right? With the objective of controlling them, with the objective of, like, why... So to reframe the question differently, in order to this knowledge node to be instrumentalized, then we should also ask ourselves, why are we producing this knowledge, or what are we trying to do with this knowledge? So why are we studying clouds?
You're saying we can't externalize this to others for using our knowledge. Also, as scientists, we have a kind of an obligation to ask this to ourselves. Yeah? What's the objective of our knowledge? What do we want to do with it? Do you agree with that?
Well, the issue is, or the goal is that, like, by producing more knowledge about clouds, we're also able to make better climate predictions, right? So to improve our climate models, which hopefully will enable us also to make better decisions, for example, about climate risks. And as of now, clouds are just such a major uncertainty in climate models, right? So obviously we get the tendency right and everything, but to really bring down the uncertainty bars, that's something that we still need to do. And that's also related not only to temperature, for example, but also things like predictions about precipitation, right? Which is also a major driver of human livelihoods. So yeah, there's definitely benefits in just studying clouds.
Yeah, so you're saying, yeah, Jeroen?
Yeah, I wanted to weigh in on that question because I think it's a very, very good question, right? Why are we studying clouds, or why are we studying or producing knowledge, any knowledge in the first place, right? Again, I will say a bit more about that in my talk, but I wanted to flag that when you're asking this question and you're answering the question, the we in the question might not be the same, right? So the question, why are we producing this knowledge, might not be about you as a scientist. It might be about we as a society, maybe as a Western society, or maybe a particular sort of institutional sort of university system. And I think that is a deeper question that we really, really need to come to grips with, because it has deep consequences down the line for whether we're not going to implement this, or how it's going to be wielded and by whom. Like, you were in a workshop last week, who is funding this research? Why are they funding this research? Where is it coming from? And I think those questions are the very first questions we need to come to terms with, and we don't have an answer at the moment.
Thanks. So you're expanding the question. It's not a question to Isabella necessarily. It's a question for us as a society.
Absolutely.
What are we aiming for with this research? All right. With that, I would like to go to our intermezzo with Letizia Artioli, who is a PhD student in Venice, but also a master's student here in The Hague at the Art Science Master's Program at the Royal Arts Academy. Yeah, and she is an artist in residence here at Studium Generale, and for every climate grief event, she's created an artwork, an installation, and also today. So please give it up for Letizia. So please tell us. We're looking at it right now. Actually, you didn't realize, but this is an artwork. And please tell us, what are we looking at?
Yeah, so since we are talking about bargaining, the point of the installation is called REM, so it's not just the phase that we all encounter as humans in our deep sleep, so where we actually put our desire and our fears, but the installation that it doesn't look like, but yeah, just pointing out, this is the installation. Actually, the name is REM because it's rapid eye movement in the generic definition that we have of that phase in our sleep. But the installation actually refers to rapid ecosystem mismatch, which is actually that in the installation you look at perspective, which is actually pointing out the scenarios and pushing it far, very far, let's suppose in 100 years more from now, so that we have two scenarios that are constantly degenerating and regenerating themselves, so a hyper-human, a hyper-anthropocentric one, and a hyper-natural. Though yet, even if these landscapes are constantly changing and they are two scenarios, the point is, do we actually take and we treat in a literal and metaphorical way the vision we are heading to? So we take the bargaining and the compromise of what do we want to dream and head off, and at the same time also we actually might know that the planet will survive, but not in the way we know life as we know it today. So these two scenarios are constantly degenerating and regenerating, following an actual REM phase of a human dream, because we cannot, I think, be disconnected from the bargaining of the vision. You can experiment it later with drinks, which is even funnier, I guess.
Thank you so much, Letitia. We'll definitely try it. So talking about dreaming about the future, which is quite literal in this installation, we come to our next speaker, who is Jeroen Omen, an assistant professor, I think, right? Yeah, at the Urban Future Studio at Utrecht University. And he studies how we think about the future and how that affects the present or should affect the present. And he also recently wrote a book about geoengineering. And you probably know the title better than me.
I hope so.
I have it here, and it's called Imagining Climate Engineering, Dreaming of the Desired Climate. So yeah, please give it up for Jeroen.
Yeah, so I've been thinking all along, right, when we were talking about what Isabella was talking about in James, and what am I going to say? Because a lot of what you brought up, and a lot of the discussion, is the kind of stuff that I think about all the time. Is it mitigation deterrence, right? Who is the we who's doing the research? What are the political consequences of doing the research in the first place? How can we govern this? Do we ever even have any clue how we govern this? All that questions. But I wanted to take sort of the bargaining question seriously and just ask with you, who's doing the bargaining, right? What if I told you you could cool the planet one reflective cloud at a time and nothing would have to change, right? You could still take your flight. You could still eat your meat. Nothing has to change about your lifestyle. Buy cooling credits now. Only $10 for a ton of CO2. And you may think this sounds ridiculous, but it's out there. Right? This is an actual startup. It's a startup that scares Isabella as much as it scares me. It's one of the things we definitely do agree on. And it's a startup that absolutely cannot deliver on its promises. Right? Tegenlicht, VPRO program, was there to film them, and they said, well, they were super amateurishly doing this. The balloon was leaking. The Tegenlicht cameraman had to wear literal gas masks because it was too dangerous to be around the balloon. So this, in particular, might not be able to deliver. But does it really matter if what they promise can happen? Does it matter whether these technologies actually will deliver what Isabella hopes they might deliver? Right? She asked that question. She said, maybe someday radiation management won't happen. Maybe we find out that it doesn't work. Does that matter politically? Can you imagine parts of society who will believe in these technologies no matter what? Right? That's one. So who's doing the bargaining? Is it us as people? Is it other people in society who just believe in the technological solution or just really do not want to believe in climate change as a big issue? Okay, bargaining one. Bargaining two. Imagine you are working in Saudi Arabia. You might be the president of today's COP. Right? You are doing climate negotiations, but at the same time, you are running an oil company. what is the best way to safeguard your future? It is promising technology will solve the problem, right? And this is not necessarily a cynical thing about them just manipulating everything. From their vantage point, it makes total sense. From their position in the global political system, it makes total sense to push for these technologies. Does it matter whether it's going to work down the line to them? Absolutely not, because they want to hook countries on oil. That's their reason for existing. Right? The entire country relies on oil to exist in the way that it does now. Vicky Holub, who is a CEO for Occidental Oil, says this very explicitly about carbon capture and storage. She says, well, it gives us a social license to operate for up to another 80 years. And she's actually quite serious. She's the one CEO that when I started researching her, I think she's actually quite serious about the climate problem. But she says, no, we don't want the end of fossil fuels. We want the end of emissions from fossil fuels. And if we can safeguard ourselves with some other technological interventions, whether it works or not, we are going to believe in that, right? What you believe, and this is where my research is in, like sociologically. So I'm somewhere in between political science and sociology, and then I have a background as a philosophy of science master student, so I get all over the place. When I look at the sociological reasoning, your vantage point determines what the system of meaning is that you're in. Right? So everything that we do, we place into a system of meaning. We give it a certain place in what we believe. I might believe fundamentally different things than someone whose entire life has been in the constraints of the oil industry, or in the constraints of TU Delft instead of the constraints of environmental humanities centers or sociology departments. Right? You will have a different belief system, so you will place these things differently. Does it matter whether they actually are going to work down the line, or are people going to believe in them now? Finally, what if you're the military? Right? The military has been one of the places, and especially the American military, that has taken climate change extremely seriously from the very beginning. Right? Our entire climate science, as we know it, was built by the US military in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It wasn't built because they were concerned about climate change. That came later. It was built because they thought, well, maybe we can control the climate and we can manipulate the weather. But then, of course, they found out very early on that they had a problem with climate change. So they know this, but their solution might not be, and I think this is not readable because it's very small. This is a very recent, this was published last week by ARIA. And ARIA is an English, newly set up agency that is related or very much like the American DARPA. So a defense research program, basically. And what they say is, our core belief is that through carefully considered engineering solutions, it may eventually be possible to actively and responsibly control the climate and weather at regional and global scale. Now that is quite a promise, and that's quite a promise that I don't think you feel very comfortable making that promise, right?
No.
But it's out there in defense documents already. And they're funding this now. So even if Isabella says, well, I'm not going anywhere near that, someone will. Someone will start tinkering on this. So that, to me, is the bargaining that we do societally. Right? And I wanted to stress that we have the tendency to to separate out the climate from all kinds of other concerns. Right? That we can solve or address climate change as a technological problem, or an economic problem, or potentially maybe a scientific problem. But when you look at it on the ground, and when you look at it from the vantage point of decision makers, it always intersects with all other concerns, right? So the question whether we're going for climate engineering is never going to be a scientific question. It's not even going to be about climate, necessarily. It's going to be about geopolitical power, and it's going to be about maintaining access to power. I will stop there. I will say this. So I wrote this book. This was my PhD thesis, and I asked all kinds of climate scientists, well, why are you doing this, and what do you feel about the possibilities for these technologies? And one of them, who became a very good friend of mine, said, sometimes I feel like I'm working on the Manhattan Project, because who knows what will happen with this technology, right? And first, back then, it was a very poignant thing to say, because it was her fear. It was her fear about am I doing the right thing? But now, it's even more interesting, because this idea is out there and it's in the back rooms of all the climate negotiations. Right? Everyone knows it's there, but it's hard to prove. So we don't know what will happen with these technologies, but we as scientists now have to really think, because there's no taking this back. It's out there. So what does that mean for our responsibility and also your responsibility? And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about. Like, what does that mean for the way we need to talk about these things? And how do we prevent it from just becoming another military solution to a complex social problem? Thank you.
I don't know if my microphone works. Yes, it's back on. I think your microphone towards the end stopped.
Yeah, it stopped working, but I hope
Is it
people
working
still heard
again?
me.
Yes, I think we could. Yes? Okay. Great. All right, thanks Jeroen. So, really interesting talk. What stood out to you from this talk?
Well, something I've been thinking about during the talks is, and that Jeroen's talk I think touched on as well, is all the ethical questions and the scientific questions we're asking about risks, and votes against geoengineering, so to speak, just make me think, you know, isn't it part of human nature to take those risks even when we don't know what they are, because that's how we got here in the first place with the Industrial Revolution and all of that kind of stuff, and power systems that will act whether we want them to or not, regardless of consequence. So, which is a very fatalistic point, I guess, to make, but does anyone have any hopeful thoughts about how we're going to address that? Maybe?
Nice question. So you were saying it made you feel a bit powerless, yeah? You felt like it's happening already, out of our sight, out of our control.
Part of what we're doing, part of being part of society, is participating in these systems, and being part of a privileged society, taking advantage of everything that we can consume, is partaking.
Right. Anyone who wants to respond to that? Maybe you just share the same feeling. Maybe you have more hopeful thoughts on this. If you want to respond, that's also possible. Okay, wait, the speakers.
You go first.
No, James first.
Thank you. I definitely shared this feeling, seeing a policy document from basically the industrial military complex in my own country, the UK. I didn't even know, I've never heard of that group. This makes me feel like, wow, I have so much less agency than I even thought I did in this. But I still think that it's worth carefully questioning that feeling of powerlessness and the assumptions that lie beneath it. And I certainly want to question the idea that just because it's human nature, this is inevitable, okay? So there are plenty of instances where possible technology options have been resisted by society. Politics has power, and that means that citizens have power. They don't have absolute power. Corporate interests and vested interests that we don't fully understand have power, but that doesn't mean that we're powerless. So think about the way in which the use of gene editing technology, which decades ago has created huge possibilities, but that have been judged not to be socially acceptable, and at least for the moment, that's meant that they haven't become completely widespread. Think also, for better or for worse, and people can reasonably disagree about this, the way in which the anti-nuclear movement, the anti-nuclear power movement in recent decades has changed many countries' policies. So grassroots political influence is a thing. writing to your elected representatives is not going to make them immediately do what you say, but it is going to shape what thoughts are in their head. Turning out in the streets, if you see a popular movement that aligns with what you, after careful deliberation, believe in, perhaps I'm a bit more of an optimist by inclination, or perhaps, you know, it's that cultivated optimism because hopelessness is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and maintaining a belief that there's a chance that you'll succeed is way more powerful than staying at home and not doing anything because you believe it's powerful. So I would say, despite all of the things we don't have control over, think carefully and maintain the belief that citizens can have a role in shaping the way that the world evolves.
So this is the climate philosopher, the philosopher of climate emotions for you. Apparently, we need to be hopeful. And please,
yeah,
Isabel.
I think I share that. You know, just that general sentiment. Maybe also, you know, by inclination, I'm also more an optimist, right? Because I think there's lots of things we can do, right? I mean, obviously, there's lots of things out of our control, but there's things we can do, you know, for like a better future. One is also education, right? And also spreading knowledge, for example, you know, and making sure that we really get together, that we collaborate, that we try to have open conversations, right? Especially across disciplines. And that we also, you know, even if it's deeply uncomfortable, try to listen. So, and that is all well within our power, right? So that's why Jeroen and I can have a discussion, you know. And we maintain friendly relations, so. No, all kidding aside, I think, so that is really important, right? Even if we also come from, like, not only by our scientific training, but also by our personal belief system, we come from very different sides of an argument, you know. I think it's really important to make the space for listening. And this is something we can, you know, we can all do, so.
I think being here was a very good idea. Very good first step. Jeroen, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I do, and I think there's several things that I want to unpack in what you said, right? First off, I want to sort of echo what they said, and especially what James said. I agree with most of it. My students ask me about this all the time. I think I'm by nature fairly optimistic. But I'm also fairly optimistic because I think that systems of belief are extremely powerful. There have been so many historical situations in which, well, James gave very specific examples now, but there's so much off limits in what we don't decide to do. There have been so many instances in which societies have been on the cusp of like creating similar sort of extractive systems and have turned back from it. Japan in the 19th century is a really interesting example. So it's not self-evident, and I think, so for someone like me, the question is always, where does political power come from? And this is why I really wanted to unpack this, because the two sort of fundamental strategies to build political power and to sort of normalize a certain political configuration is, one, is what people call naturalization. Right? It is by nature. People are by nature selfish, or they're by nature inquisitive and scientific, or they're by nature very conservative. You get them all the time, right? Or it's unnatural to be gay. Like all of that is in there. It's never really true because we have absolutely no clue what human nature is because there's so much diversity. The other one that you also need to unpack is historical inevitability. Also not true, we also just don't know. But if you build your argument based on that, maybe take a step back and like actually think, well, our systems of belief are quite malleable. So we could have a different world, potentially. Just maybe not right now. I'm very scared of this.
Thanks. So you're kind of saying, make sure you don't step into a self-fulfilling fallacy where you kind of create this narrative, we can't do it because this is just who we are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and think not just a self-fulfilling narrative where we fall into that trap. It serves political purpose, right? There are very many people who want you to believe that story because it serves them.
There's power behind that, yeah. All right, thanks.
Yeah, I'm also generally very optimistic.
We all now introduce ourselves as either as optimists, yeah?
Yeah, I just would like to challenge a bit what has been said. So is it like this, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of historical examples, but in this case, it doesn't seem it's working. Like climate protests are full of people, green parties are rising, but then we have things like COP28 now and lobbying are completely driving the politics, like the agenda on climate. So, I mean, is it really, or maybe there is something else we should do? Because, yeah, it doesn't seem that what we are doing is actually working.
Yeah, because you're saying, okay, maybe in history we have seen examples, but there's no, or you're saying there's little evidence of it's happening now, right? Do you want to respond to that? Any of the speakers?
I saw a hand there immediately going up.
Someone wants to respond?
Yes, because, well, it isn't obvious to me that what we have now is such a bad thing. Look, yesterday I got a phone call which said that somebody needs to be resuscitated, like on the other side of the block, and I ran there and I went there, and there were like 2 police cars and 2 ambulances, which are fossil fueled vehicles, right? And they saved the person's life. And I look at these things and it's like, well, look at all the benefits of the Industrial Revolution which they have provided. Like, I've been able to go to school, no malnutrition in the West, as far as I know. Like all these, we have eradicated a lot of preventable disease, like cholera, stuff like that. I look at all these benefits and I'm like, well, the cost of these benefits is climate change. And that is a cost. I'm not happy about it. But doesn't all these things which are on this hand outweigh the cost of climate change? And you're saying it's like, well, you look at COP and say, well, these people, they want the fossil fuels to still be there. And for me, that's very logical, because if I get a heart attack right now, I would want 2 ambulances, 2 police cars, which are fossil fueled vehicles, to be there like the next minute, right? So
you're saying if it was so simple that it was 100% bad, these fossil fuel industries, then we would have made different choices, and they also had benefits for us. Yeah? Yeah? All right. Do you want to respond to that? I'd love so much to unpack there.
Go ahead.
Thanks. So on this last point, I do think it's right. If people who are advocating an immediate stop to all fossil fuel usage, I mean, I'm just not sure who those people are. I don't think that's what people are talking about when they're advocating climate justice. No, even Extinction Rebellion is not advocating the immediate phase out of fossil fuels. So this seems like a little bit of a false dichotomy to me. And yeah, so when people talk about the transition to a clean energy system, yeah, no one's saying ambulances should be robbed of petrol immediately. So I think that's something I want to just question as a framing. But in terms of this optimism and pessimism, is anything working? One thing that fills me with hope, and sometimes I see climate activists being a little bit too, in my view, slow to acknowledge their own victories, is the fact that, so if you read analyses of climate change from the early 2000s, for example, the Stern Review, which was a major look at the costs and benefits, concluding that the costs of continuing emitting were actually, in terms of human suffering, were far greater than the benefits of continuing emitting. I'm waffling slightly. Anyway, in 2004, for Nicholas Stern, business as usual meant round about 6-7 degrees of warming. Now, if we stick with currently implemented policies, that's around about 3 degrees of warming. The outlook looks dramatically better because countries have adopted net zero targets. They have dramatically increased offshore wind, onshore wind, solar. I don't think we're there yet. We're not on track to stabilize the climate. We're not on track to keep warming safely below 2 degrees. If things don't change, we're really seriously risking leaving the current geological epoch for a much more chaotic and perhaps much less human-friendly planet. But the idea that the political activism and the political discussion that's happened over the last 2 or 3 decades has done nothing, I think is completely incorrect. We're dramatically in a better position than we would have been if the Nicholas Sterns and the Greta Thunbergs of this world had stayed at home.
All right. I see some nodding, so I'm assuming that there is some echoing. You want to give a final remark before we do the closing?
Yeah, no, I actually do think I have to take both of these because I think it's very important. I think first, beyond the false dichotomy, it also seems to be based on a misreading of how we got into fossil fuels in the first place. Because historically that wasn't necessarily about its economic benefits, not even about its energetic benefits. It seems to be that it was very convenient for the people who at that point controlled factories, because it allowed them to concentrate all their production in one place, which at that point was not economically feasible, but it gave them more political control, right? So that's the first thing. We shouldn't just think of all the benefits, we should also think about all the societies that have been destroyed in the meantime that actually did not have poverty, that did not have the kind of hardships that a lot of societies now have over the earth. Burma is a very great example that was destroyed for its resources, that actually wasn't poor at all, that had a much more egalitarian society than we have now. So it's easy to say, well, that everything now is progress and better, but that the reality of that situation is just a far more complex story there. Right? So I think that's the first part. But then I wanted to take it to your question about, because here I actually don't fully share what you're saying. I think a lot has happened, and I think if we isolate climate change from all other sort of concerns that we have about the natural world, there is some reason for optimism. Not enough, but some. The problem is that we've been doing this in such a way that we are increasing our resource use on precious metals, for example, in a sixfold, right, between now and 2050. We don't even know if we can reach the resource extraction, and if we do, we really do not know the costs. And it's because you're asking, should we be doing something differently? And I think the answer is yes, because we haven't really talked fundamentally about what it is that we're all aspiring to be as a society. And we have been trying to isolate the question of climate, and it was very good to get it on the agenda, but it's not very good to find solutions, because you get this narrative where, oh, you have to give up meat, you have to give up flying, you have to give up this and that, and the world's going to shit, right? That's basically what you get. Instead of, what is a better world that you could be in that is also sustainable? And how do we actually create a politics around that? Why do we have a politics in which we allow fossil advertising to continue by and large? Like, over the past 10 years, cars, which used to be just personal cars, have become 70% of the new cars being sold are SUVs. Why? Makes no sense, right? It's like 1.5 times more environmentally sort of destructive to do that. So these kinds of things we have never made a politics around, and it's also because it's lobbied away, of course, but like, that should be our aim as climate activists, because we can't solve the problem without like spreading the argument around a bit more broadly. Sorry, I had to take that.
Yeah, thank you so much for your elaboration.
I just want to add one thing to that.
Where is it? Oh, yeah. Sorry, I heard it coming from the left.
No, that's why I put out there, that there is vulnerable communities, so the goal is to really make people who are not super well off better off, in the future. So, and I think this is really where we all unite, we might be coming at it at different angles and perspectives, but this is really, what we should have in mind. And there's like lots of different ways we could achieve that. And as Jeroen mentioned, there's also lots of different trade-offs, right? So, I mean, poor people, for example, are not only worried about climate change, but about health, about safety, about lots of different things. And climate is like one element that's very crucial, but it's not the only thing. So, and all those things, therefore, need to be tackled from different perspectives. So,
thank you so much. So this is why interdisciplinary meetings like this are very good, right? All right. I think with looking at the time, I think it's a good idea to move on to the drinks, maybe have a look at the artwork. So I really want to thank you for your participation today, and maybe see you at the next and final event on acceptance in the Climate Grief series. Thank you so much.